Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for braving Salem on the day after Halloween. As you noticed, there was still quite a bit of activity going on out there. Um, as Jim said, I'm Janie Winchell, PEM's Art and Nature Center Director and Natural History Curator, plus the Program Coordinator for ECOC. Thanks for joining us this evening for our co-hosted program, Birds and Bird Flu in a Changing World. It's really my privilege to introduce Nicola Hill, and I'm really looking forward to her presentation this evening. Originally from Sydney, Australia, Nicola Hill has spent over 15 years studying how pathogens that originate in animals jump or spill over to humans. She has studied parasitism in Australian marsupials while earning her PhD in biology at the Macquarie University, and I may not be pronouncing that right. Avian influenza in wild birds during her postdocs at UC Davis and MIT, and COVID-19 in animals and humans as research assistant professor at Tufts. Currently an assistant professor at UMass Boston, Dr. Hill started the Virus Plus Lab, where she and her team are working to uncover super spreaders of avian influenza and what we can learn from these hosts to curb the now global spread in wildlife. Understanding how viruses such as avian influenza or bird flu originate in wild ducks, geese, and gulls and spread to marine mammals and humans is a primary question that drives her work. Professor Hill takes an eco-evo approach to this question and the study of the complex dynamics of viral spillover. A key motivation for her work is to develop equitable, real-world solutions to aid in the control of infectious diseases, like bird flu, and protect biodiversity. By fostering collaborations across disciplines, her lab hopes to harness the power of interdisciplinary research to advance scientific understanding and develop innovative solutions for a better prepared, healthier, and more sustainable world. Who knew that one of the leading researchers on bird flu was right in our backyard at UMass Boston? I certainly didn't. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nicola.
Thank you, Janie, and thank you, Jim. It's really such an honor to be here and talk to you a little bit tonight on the heels of Halloween, which is really a big ask. So thank you for turning up and lending your ears and your brain cells for a little bit of science tonight. Just Sarah, technical, I can't see the monitor, if that's okay. That's a thumbs up. All right, good. So I'm going to talk to you about birds and bird flu in a changing world. And I think the reason that we're really all here is because we love birds. And so I wanted to share a little bit of footage. This is from my field site in Alaska. And this is, you can see, I'll just leave it with you for a couple minutes of silence. So you kind of have to train your eye a little bit initially to the size. These are a bunch of mostly western, but some least sandpipers that are on their spring migration northward up to the Arctic tundra, and they stop over at the Copper River Delta right in the Gulf of Alaska. And so for about 10 days, if you can get it right, you can see thousands upon thousands of these sandpipers. As you can see, they're probing the sand for their diet and for their food. Birds just give us joy. And I think that's what brings us all out here tonight as well. So in a world where not a lot of things make sense anymore, I think a lot of us make sense of the world through birds. So we can use birds to, because of their migration and their annual cycle, birders don't need calendars, they just have to look out the window and you can tell what season it is. So this is the spring migration in Cordova. Birds are also a source of great parenting advice, of course. These are parenting role models. Right here, you can see common terns. If you train your eye a little bit, you can see the chick that is a little bit sort of forward on the screen. And of course, these are parents that are quite aggressive in their strategies of taking care of their chicks as well. So there's a lot to learn from the parenting that birds perform. Of course, birds, including gulls, will make really interesting / questionable dietary choices. This is, of course, a gull that's eating a starfish. That's a relatively normal food choice for a bird. I have trapped gulls throughout Massachusetts and different parts of Alaska and other parts of the world too. And you've probably all seen sometimes chicken skewers or KFC or fries or whatever it is, but you've got to respect these birds for getting out there and always making sure that they're getting their food source. And lastly, they have excellent interpersonal communication skills. So color, song, plumage, all of these things are amazing communication strategies between birds that are really unparalleled in the animal kingdom. So for all of these reasons, I think maybe you as well as I can make sense of the world through our observation of birds. So I really like wild birds, and this is a photo of me on the left, and I'm releasing a northern pintail. This is when I was doing work in Bangladesh, and it's wearing a tiny, tiny satellite transmitter on its back. The other thing that I really like are viruses. And I hope tonight, by the end of this conversation, I can actually convince you to like viruses just a little bit, or maybe just to appreciate their role in the world. So viruses are great, and we need them to function. Yes, I really did say that. And I know that comes hard to hear on the back of a pandemic, and now looking down the barrel of a panzootic of bird flu, but it's actually the case, and I'll see if I can convince you why. So viruses are not merely agents of destruction, but they're essential components of global ecosystems. And here are a few reasons to love viruses. So some of the reasons to love viruses include they regulate populations and they prevent a single species from becoming overabundant and from dominating and therefore causing an imbalance in a particular ecosystem. They're responsible for nutrient cycling, and I'll talk about an example where viruses, because they eat bacteria, they actually create oxygen for us to breathe. And lastly, they promote biodiversity. So viruses are evolutionary drivers of genetic diversity and adaptation. So for all of these reasons, viruses are actually pretty great. Here's a specific example. This is actually a virus. This is called a bacteriophage. You will notice that it looks like a lunar space shuttle, and I'm pretty sure that this is where NASA got their design, but this is actually a virus. It looks kind of different from that icosahedral soccer ball that you probably came to know about during COVID-19. Really, really different morphology. And it's actually eating a bacteria in the ocean. So these are viruses that will eat bacteria. So viruses go around, and what they do is that they will, by the ecological principle of killing the winner, and a lot of it is in the name, as you can imagine, these are viruses that go around and they eat overabundant marine bacteria, and they're killed by phage. And so this is a classic role that viruses will play in actually regulating our oceans. And by doing that, viruses will regulate these overabundant bacterial species, and this allows zooplankton to do their job of generating oxygen and photosynthesizing. If viruses weren't going around and actually eating bacteria, the oceans would be overwhelmed with bacteria, and we wouldn't get any of the zooplankton and phytoplankton that are responsible for generating oxygen. That which generates 50% of the planet's oxygen that's going into your lungs right now. So that relationship wouldn't be possible without viruses going around and killing marine bacteria. And so here's a slightly different example. We're going to move from the deep oceans way out to Yellowstone. Maybe some of you have been there. So before I get into that, I want to explain that viruses can actually form symbiotic relationships. In ecology, we learn about this on a spectrum. On the left-hand side, we have antagonism, which means one member benefits at the expense of another. Commensalism, so somewhere in the middle. So one member benefits with no consequence for another. And on the other extreme, we have all members receiving benefits during a mutualistic relationship. Viruses have been vilified, and I'm here to tell you that. Most of the time, we understand viruses as antagonists of a system, that they're out there, they're killing machines, they're turning host cells into viral factories, and they're causing death and destruction. And that's not the case. They occupy many different ecological roles, from commensalism all the way to mutualism, and I'll explain to you about a mutualism right now. So it turns out that viruses can help plants to adapt. They can form this really interesting three-way symbiotic relationship with plants and fungi. Yeah, 3 ways. Viruses, fungi, plants. Gets complicated, but it's worth it. So viruses can not only infect bacteria and humans and birds, they can also infect fungi. And so a virus that infects fungi actually, and you can see it in the illustration up the top, we have infection of the virus. It's shown there in these little icosahedral pyramids they have little red genomes inside. That's infecting C. protuberata, which is a fungi that infects this plant. So without that virus infecting that fungi, that plant wouldn't be able to tolerate these geothermal soils that occur in Yellowstone. These are really hot temperatures. When experiments are done and they cure the fungi of the virus, these plants cannot grow or tolerate. So it's thanks to these viruses that are helping plants to adapt to a warming planet. So that's an extreme example of a mutualism, but again, just putting it out there that there's many ways that we should actually be thankful for viruses on the planet. So here's a bit of a thought experiment. If I asked you, would you prefer to have all viruses eliminated from the planet? A lot of people would say absolutely, in a heartbeat, take them away. And here's the reality, that if all viruses disappeared, the world would be a wonderful place for about a day and a half, maybe not even, and then we'd all die. So you can see the reasons why our planet, our own health, the oxygen that we breathe is totally a function of viruses getting out there and doing their job of infecting other different organisms on the planet. They regulate, they keep everything in an equilibrium, they allow for biodiversity, and they allow and they facilitate other species to even adapt to changing conditions, such as climate change, of course. So I'll leave you with that and we'll move on. Here's the other piece of this. There are many viruses out there. We're continually exposed to viruses, but the majority of these interactions are completely uneventful. There's actually, it turns out, we only have 14,000 species of viruses that are known. So we're pretty far behind bacteria and other animal life forms as well. And here shown is all of the human viruses that we know to occur. Let's see if I can get this going. Yes. So here's Neil deGrasse Tyson telling you that's nothing. 120 species out of the 14,000 that occur, come on, that's not even a drop in the ocean when it comes to the number of viruses that care about actually infecting humans. Turns out viruses are super specific. Most of them don't even care about you. But when viruses do infect us, the result can be really devastating. Oh boy. So we are now 7.8 billion on the planet, and when viruses do infect us, it's a time. So, what's the last pandemic that you remember? You might not have to think very hard about it. I'll give you another second. Yes, thank you. Coronavirus. Okay, so this is a very, very important gift. This is what the kid's talking about. This is Cardi B. If you didn't know her, this absolutely went viral right before the COVID-19 pandemic happened. Her concert was cancelled due to the coronavirus. And this was the moment that I think a lot of people actually sat up and took notice that the coronavirus was actually turning into a pandemic. So I often thank Cardi B for this point. But viruses will show us dysfunction in any system. So if nothing else, if we can't have gratitude for all the other roles that viruses perform, in a lot of ways, when viruses outbreak or spill over or form these, become pandemic, which means an outbreak that's global in scale, it's viruses that are showing us that something is awry in the system that really we need to pay attention to. And so, what we see, yep, I'll get all these animations going. So how do viruses signal dysfunction? A bunch of stuff. So initially they'll show this increase in host range, geographic expansion. They'll start to evolve towards virulence, which means they just start to become more deadly in a host where they shouldn't be. And also frequent host jumping. So you start to notice a signal of things changing where viruses will spread quite quickly between host species that are completely unrelated. Those are signals that you know that something is up in your system. So here's COVID-19 right down the bottom. And you can see here are 4 other influenza outbreaks. This is pandemics over the course of human history, right? And so COVID-19, you can see also the mortality rate approaching 7 million. But you can also see 4 other influenza pandemics that happened in around the last century, including Spanish influenza 1918, which was an H1N1 subtype. That had a huge mortality rate of 40 to 50 million, sort of dwarfs COVID when you think of the comparison. So influenza is an extremely interesting virus to study for its capacity to tell us about dysfunction in the system, and it's very, very good at jumping between hosts. So for all of those different strains of flu that were a source of pandemics over the last century of human history, all of them originated from wild birds. You have to go way far back in an evolutionary tree to understand that, but we understand that water birds are actually reservoirs for all influenza subtypes. So seasonal influenza, the reason that you go and get your annual flu shot, originally many tens of thousands, if not millions of years ago, actually originated in an avian species. And so we understand that wild birds actually host this enormous diversity of influenza A viruses that are capable of switching host at certain times during their history. So this is a photo of northern pintail, again from Alaska, which is a study site of mine. But here's the interesting part of that. While wild birds are considered these natural reservoirs for influenza, the way that birds experience influenza, or low pathogenic avian influenza, is a lot like we experience the common cold. So it's kind of annoying. It's a little bit, maybe you feel a bit groggy, and it definitely hits harder for the younger generation as well. So we definitely see that amongst juvenile birds. They will tend to be hit harder by low pathogenic avian influenza. But you'll probably, if you were experiencing the common cold, you might just tough it out and turn up to work that day. And so it's very similar to the way birds experience low path. It's sort of like this mild discomfort, we think. And we think it's subtle but cumulative. And so we're starting to get some data from satellite telemetry that lets us know that when birds are actually infected with low path, we see subtly delayed migration. So the effects of an infection with low path tend to be, sort of more subtle. Let's put it this way, they're not falling out of the sky dead with low pathogenic avian influenza, unlike its deadly cousin that we'll talk about in a little bit. So viruses can sometimes spill over from wildlife into humans, and often in the animal reservoir, you'll hear about the fact that in that animal reservoir, you didn't see any symptoms, or it was very mildly symptomatic at most. We see mild disease. And a zoonotic transmission event happens when a virus spills over. It undertakes this huge host jump from an animal into a human. And on the human end of it, it causes severe disease. This is an antagonistic relationship now. This virus is not co-evolved with this host, and the disease is very, very obvious, and you can see the symptoms. So I've used a bat there as an example for SARS-CoV-2, but there are many other examples where bats, you might have heard about, can be a source of viruses for human infection. Influenza is a little different in how it operates. So influenza can spill over from wildlife into humans, but it often requires an agricultural host in the middle. So highly pathogenic avian influenza never ever evolves to that deadly form in wild birds. That only happens in poultry. And then from poultry, typically a lot of the human cases happen due to exposure to an infected flock of poultry, is typically the narrative so far that we have for this. So we're talking about that ecological process of kill the winner. When you put an agricultural host, when we domesticate a distant cousin, is how I would put it, when we're talking about chickens, but we're talking about a species that often is in huge numbers, packed in, and they can be quite immunosusceptible. And these create conditions for the virus to become more deadly. And it's not hard to see why. So poultry and industrialized farming, really high stocking rates, right? So these animals usually only, their lifespan or their turnover is about 6 weeks, and then they're replenished and restocked again and again and again and again. So this endless supply of susceptible, naive hosts for the virus to infect means there are no consequences for being deadly in this situation. Being deadly is not selected against like it is in wild birds, actually. So these are the conditions, and this is not controversial to say. All flu biologists fully understand that food production has basically created the conditions for the virus to mutate into a more deadly form, and that's well known. And here's the part that's the real tragedy, I'm sure, especially for this group, but many, many people that I've talked to, scientists and the public alike. So while it's poultry, where we see evolution to this highly pathogenic form that's really, really deadly, and I should say it's also deadly in humans too. It's about 50% mortality rate, so it's a bit of a coin toss as to whether you survive infection or not. But when highly pathogenic avian influenza has actually started shifting back into wild birds. So that's where things get really, really uncomfortable. And I just really want to reinforce that evolution of that deadly strain doesn't happen in wild birds. That happens in poultry, and then we get spillover into wild birds as a consequence of that. So this is really complex stuff. I teach virology, and I have to spend like a couple of lectures on this, like unpacking how low path and high path works, and in what populations it evolves and what populations it is susceptible. So hopefully I can get distill some of these messages so it makes sense to this group as well. All right, so this is some footage of my group, my lab. We have UMass has a field station on Nantucket, and we went earlier this year. We go a couple of times a year just to do transects and to understand where we're at in the middle of this pandemic. And so this is some footage from that. So this is up at Great Point. I'm not sure if any folks have been there. Of course, we're just absolutely surrounded by common eider, both hens and drakes. You can see all the footprints as well. This is a well-visited area. And I'm sorry that I didn't actually show you the beauty of Great Point. It's absolutely stunning if you've ever been there on Nantucket. and it's a huge overwintering ground for a lot of our sea ducks. And so this was really, really tough going to actually witness this. And so all the birds you were seeing, our lab would go out there, we would sample them, collect swabs, and run them. So I have a lab back at UMass Boston where we're able to screen all of these swabs and say whether we have nothing, whether we have low path, and whether we have high path pretty quickly. But it was devastating. We saw a really, really big spike in deaths earlier this year. It's somewhat come down, but we'll be tracking it because we're at the point now where highly pathogenic avian influenza is occurring. It's not consistent, but it occurs. We get big spikes and then it goes away, and then another big spike, and then it'll simmer down. So we don't really understand its pattern. We think it's a little stochastic right now, but it's certainly not going away, is how I could explain it. But dead birds occurring here, and I mean in Massachusetts, is actually really new for us when that hasn't been the case for the rest of the world. So this is me up the top. I'm holding, this is a ruddy shelduck. This is Akdi George. He's a vet from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. This is in Mongolia about 10 years ago, and that's just indicates how long I've been studying bird flu. He's a really experienced bleeder. You don't need to be worried about this image. So experienced bleeders know how to take some blood from the jugular, and it's a very efficient and painless process for this bird. This is me, those are my hands. I'm holding a common teal, and you can see we've got a little satellite transmitter backpack on this bird, and we were trying to understand their migration route through different parts of Europe and Asia, specifically the Middle East. This is always an interesting photo because we didn't take it. This is an absolutely stunning teal, but we didn't take it at the time to give a profile shot of this gorgeous bird. You can actually see my boss, his back, and he's on the other side of him is an Egyptian policeman who's asking us, why are you putting bombs on these birds? So this was a really interesting part of Egypt, quite near a sort of political hotspot that's in the news a lot right now. But this was incumbent on us. We were the researchers turning up from a Western country and putting satellite transmitters on their local birds. We had the permits to do it, but it just goes to show the importance of doing education and outreach to these populations. So it got pretty sticky there for a while, and I wasn't sure what the fate of it would be, but it all ended well. And we got really lovely data from these birds as well. So we got some great science out of this project. This is Bangladesh. This is how we do mist netting in Bangladesh for water birds. And so I have traveled to many different parts of the globe to understand why wild birds are dying of bird flu. And most recently, I didn't have to travel very far. And I guess this is like the really spooky part of this, is that I don't need to travel to different parts of the globe to understand or to sample or to investigate wild bird outbreaks anymore. This is happening right here. But understand that this is a relatively recent phenomenon compared to the rest of the world, including Europe and Asia. So this gives a little bit of a breakdown of how this situation happened. We have, along the x-axis, you can see time, starting in about 1996. And along my y-axis, I have broken this down into sort of like 4 regions, right? So I've got Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. So in 2005, we had a really big outbreak in wild birds. This happened at Qinghai Lake. This was the event that made everyone sit up. It just gave you the chills. We knew about highly pathogenic avian influenza in poultry, but this was a huge outbreak that happened in bar-headed geese, in Pallas's gulls, many important water bird species along the Central Asian Plateau. And boom, we saw this huge outbreak. And you can see, oh, sorry, I should backtrack and explain that these green bubbles are known outbreak events from the literature, and the gray bubbles are all of the United Nations and the World Organization for Animal Health counts of outbreaks too. So I have 2 data sources for this because it's sometimes kind of tricky to track these in remote parts of the globe. And so what you can see for Asia is fairly consistent, sort of endemic outbreaks, relatively small scale, but there you go. There's the backbone of the outbreak that led a lot of people to think this is where we saw emergence of the virus, and it has been simmering away for quite a long time until we had a bit of a switch. Somewhere along about 2011, we think we saw this new interesting strain of the virus that you'll hear called highly pathogenic H5N1 clade 2.3.4.4b. I didn't name this stuff. I really apologize. I wish virologists did a better job with it. At least COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 got, the interesting sort of like Greek alphabet, is that right? But we haven't been there. But I think with bird flu, it has been evolving for so long, they're actually running out of options about how to name all of these different interesting clades that have evolved since this time. Anyway, so clade 2.3.4.4, I'll really try not to say that name again and again, but that's when we saw this distinct change in the pattern of outbreaks that was happening. That was when we started to see outbreaks that were bigger that we had never seen before in Africa. Our first one in the Americas actually came across in 2014, 2015. And we think that happened via the Pacific Flyway, so movement of wild birds from different parts of East Asia, through East Siberia in Russia, across the Bering Strait and into the Pacific Northwest, probably via Alaska, although surveillance was a little patchy and we didn't catch it there, but we can infer that that's probably what happened. And then it kind of simmered down, and we really, really thought that's the end of it. We won't get any more high path in wild birds in North America. And then in about 2021/2022, we now have a huge outbreak that's ongoing for multiple years, and there's no sign of it actually slowing down at this point. But you can see it was also simmering away in different parts of Europe as well before it actually, we saw our big outbreak in 2021 in Canada and the US. So for those of us who had been, sort of studying bird flu for quite a long time, you get this sort of long game perspective on what's going on. We were like, this, all of the things that you worry about. On the left-hand side, oh no, it's coming. We were seeing bigger and bigger outbreaks. We were seeing it across different parts of the globe like we hadn't before. And then finally, in about 2021, 2022, was the other side of this, where it had just blown up. And we don't have a pandemic of bird flu. I need to clarify that in humans. That means we have human infections of bird flu that are global. That's not what is happening. But this is a pandemic in wild birds. So the special name that's given to that is a panzootic. So now we have this interesting strain of highly pathogenic avian influenza that's not just brewing in parts of Asia or Europe anymore. It's switched over into parts of North America. You know how this story goes. South America. Now it's on the Antarctic. I have to check if it's the Antarctic mainland now. Where I'm from in Australia is probably one of the last continents where we haven't seen bird flu, but I think it's a matter of time. And so I'll just speed through these parts as well. So again, all of the things that we talk about when viruses show us dysfunction, that's exactly what was happening around that time. Over the last 10 years, we were seeing increases in host range, geographic expansion, evolution of virulence, and frequent host jumping. So how did this virus get here? So this is kind of like a big question that we've all been trying to ponder. Yes, I've shown you the data that shows it now has arrived and it's circulating in North America for sure, but we wanted to better understand what exactly happened that meant that this virus was actually jumping across the Atlantic and into Canada and the US at that point. So this was a study that we did, done by a really talented PhD student at the time at Tufts that I was working with, John Gass. And what we did was we actually took all of these viral genomes that were sequenced from wild birds, and we made huge family trees of them. So these were trees that were like thousands of highly pathogenic avian influenza viral genomes put together. And because viruses mutate so quickly, it's almost like they have a passport of where they have been and the host species that they've infected. There's a lot of information that you can get from a viral genome. Nothing evolves as quickly as viruses. And so they're really, really an interesting source of information. And basically what that told us was that Northern Europe has become this new jumping off point for virus spread into the Americas. And that was the first time we'd ever seen that in around 2021 slash 2022. And so it came to, and other researchers have produced similar results that support this, that what we were seeing was higher than usual activity of highly pathogenic avian influenza in Northern Europe, that really laid the groundwork for the virus to then spill over and become and land in the Canadian Maritime provinces, which is what we saw. Not a lot of surveillance is done in this part of the world, and it gets really tricky to understand exactly how this happened. But just to orient you, you're looking at a polar-centric view of the Northern Hemisphere. We've got Iceland shown there. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have Northeast US, Northeast Canada, Greenland, and on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see mainland Europe. Like I say, not a lot of surveillance is done there. So we took some of the IUCN Red List maps for different gull ranges, duck ranges, goose ranges, and shorebird ranges. And as you can imagine, this place is, there's a lot of, what do we call it? Hop, skip, and jump. So many birds were probably involved in the movement of the virus from Europe into Northeast Canada. We don't think it's just one, we think it's multiple birds that were probably involved in that movement from east to west like this. And so we have some viral genomes that suggest a little bit more, gives a little bit more taxonomic resolution about how that happened. And then it was, sorry, Sarah, can you go back one? Thanks. And so, yes, thank you. And so the first cases of high path we detected were, of course, in Canada, that were in about December 21 in a great black-back gull, as well as poultry. And so this was found concurrently. This was poultry in an exhibit farm in, I think it's like St. John's or New Brunswick, I can't remember actually now, but this was, they were found concurrently. And while these were the first cases that were detected, we don't think that these species alone were involved. We think that there's a myriad of other species that were probably involved in like reshuffling and helping to shift the virus at that, like that across the Atlantic. So we know, based on the viral sequence work that we've done, it actually took a really, really long time for this jumping off a moment to happen. So about 10 years led up to that transatlantic jump. And then when it did, when it moved into the US and Canada, it moved incredibly quickly. At that point, there was almost no stopping it. And so what we were seeing was a lot of really rapid movement between different parts of the US, including the Northeast to the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic, over the upper Midwest, to the Northern Rockies and Plains, and different parts of the Americas. And so it was very rapidly shifting along the Atlantic coast, but also from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So we now think that we have about 5 incursion events of avian influenza of 2344B from Europe into the North Atlantic at this point. So it's just starting to be, we don't think it's hard to say with regularity or any temporal signal of when this is happening, but we've had 5 events over a very short period. And on the other side, so we did this work really, really early on. Right after the outbreak started in North America, and about a year later there was an incursion event via the Pacific Flyway into Alaska and down the Pacific Northwest as well. So it's basically at this point both the Pacific and the Atlantic Rim are acting as sort of gateways to transmission of the virus. Do we ever see virus going back up and out into Europe? Not very often. There's a really interesting signal there where birds move across, the virus arrives, and then we don't see the reverse going on, which is kind of interesting. All right, so a question that's really also prominent for a lot of us in this field is what is actually driving spread in wild birds? So I showed you a lot of arrows that would imply these birds are not dead. There is something moving this virus. So there's way more to this story than just finding dead carcasses and trying to understand through viral genomes what is going on. So this has been a really big question for all of us in this field as well. And here's the understanding of where we're at. Not all wild birds are dying is the update I would like to provide today. Some are actually showing mild disease or even recover. So what we think happens is poultry act as a source of high path, and then it can shift into wild birds, but we get multiple different outcomes at this point. We don't know what's going on. So we see these severe cases, but we also see birds that are recovering, and we also see mild disease. So birds are oftentimes like mallards or dabbling ducks that you hold in your hand, and you have no idea that they're actually shedding highly pathogenic avian influenza anymore. So we're trying to address this dogma that the virus is absolutely killing wild birds when we don't think that's what's going on. I think for too long the field has thought of wild birds as a bit of a monolith and not understanding how ecologically diverse wild birds are and how they behave in different ways as hosts for the virus. So what do we think of these species that might be suffering from strictly mild disease and sometimes not even showing symptoms? We do think, and we have a lot of suspicions, that dabbling ducks, including mallards, and yes, to some degree, northern pintail too, might be acting as super spreaders in this outbreak. And here is the big reason why when we see a lot of these mass mortality events going on in colonies of seabirds and other species, even Canada geese, for example, we do not see these mass mortalities happening in dabbling ducks. And so that's kind of given us a bit of a heads up that we might have some variation, and these might be hosts that are able to actually tolerate the virus. What was the other piece? Yep, I think that was the piece that I wanted to say with this. Oh, the other key about ducks acting as potential super spreaders is that they have a bit of a head start. Because they're reservoirs for low path, their host defenses have probably co-evolved to the virus, where they have a bit of a jump on how to neutralize, not totally kill, but how to control the virus, turning it back into the common cold. So we're shifting now here from going to a deadly virus back into the common cold, which is kind of interesting to observe. So why am I really interested in finding super spreaders? I'm a little bit obsessed with this, actually. I'm not one of those labs that actually goes out. We do go out and we do collections and we will sample dead birds. They're absolutely out there. But I think a lot more interesting ecological information about how to get answers and control this virus lies in these super spreaders. So there's two reasons that really matter to me about this. And the first is super spreaders are key to understanding and predicting the spread of this disease. So a lot of those arrows that you saw probably could be explained by the movement of dabbling ducks. And so we think where we have dabbling ducks, we better understand where the virus is turning up. And secondly, super spreaders are key to stopping this virus as well. So we need to understand the secrets of how these birds are actually controlling infection to better understand how to stop it. So we think that these birds have some of the secrets that lie in their host defenses. So we're trying to collect blood samples and better understand a little bit about how their immune system is responding. There's probably no better way to understand how to control a virus than looking at low pathogenic or high pathogenic avian influenza in a mallard. They get absolutely exposed a lot to low path. They're often fighting multiple subtypes at different stages throughout their life, so they acquire a lot of immunity against these viruses. And so there's a lot more work to be done on understanding how it is that these birds tend to be able to control the virus without showing any symptoms. And I wish I had more to tell you about this, but we're still really only learning about how this is done. So finding super spreaders is a complicated job. It's way more complicated, and you can see on the left-hand side all of the birds and the different pathways. If you follow the susceptible to symptomatic to death, of course, these are birds that we were seeing, like the common eider that we get on Nantucket, or the Canada geese that we were seeing in urban Boston and different parts of the North Shore as well during that outbreak. That relies on passive surveillance. So that's agencies or folks going out and saying, there's a dead bird, we need to sample that. But in the middle, we need to understand more about how these birds may be recovering, and that requires more collaboration with rehabilitation clinics and also getting our hands dirty and doing active surveillance. So really going out into the field and sampling wild birds to see if they're actually shedding the virus but also healthy. So these are the parts of the equation where my lab is involved, is these collaborations with rehabs and also doing active surveillance. So this is where we have been targeting our efforts. Every year since this outbreak started, we go to Appledore Island. This is in the Isles of Shoals, an amazing, for folks who've been there, you know what I'm saying, an amazing colony for great blackback gulls and also herring gulls, just phenomenal. So this is a place that is under the management and jurisdiction of UNH, the University of New Hampshire, as well as Cornell. Some amazing studies there done on gull communication. A couple of years ago in 2022, this colony saw an outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza in herring gulls and great blackback gulls, and we have been returning there ever since to continue doing surveillance and better understanding the transmission dynamics there. We also do active surveillance in Boston Harbor Islands, and our other site is Nantucket Island, where we go. UMass has a field station out there, also an amazing location, and that's where we get also a lot of overwintering ducks. But we collaborate with rehabilitation clinics, including Tufts, have a great rehabilitation site out in Grafton, the New England Wildlife, and Wildcare Cape Cod. There's probably others that we should be collaborating with too, but these are the three that we work with, and they've been really, really important for us to try and find birds that might be infected but just aren't dying of infection as well. And working with rehabs is the only way that we have been able to understand that there are species that have recovered. So these are different from ducks. It's very rare to see ducks moving through rehabs because they don't get sick and they don't die of infection, but we can get a lot of information from other species, including common terns, a pair of great blackback gull, an American green-winged teal, and even a turkey vulture. So these are all species that we confirmed, as this was in collaboration with Wendy Puryear's lab at Tufts University, who are doing also really important work in this space as well. And these were birds that actually recovered. So they were given supportive care, and then a couple of weeks later, they just shook it off. You would never have known that they were infected, and they were allowed to be released to the wild. But I cannot emphasize how hard this work is to do. So these rehabs are often overwhelmed. They have to triage animals all the time. And if a bird comes in with symptoms that may be flu-like, oftentimes that's really challenging for them to actually give supportive care to these animals because they don't want to risk a contagious event to their other intake animals, and it requires special resources for quarantining. But without rehabs, we would have had no idea that there are species of birds that are actually able to recover like this and get this type of really, really important information. I'll wrap this up quickly. And just you might recognize this particular species. This was the one on which we first detected highly pathogenic avian influenza in the Americas. So there's something interesting simmering away here about some of these birds. We do see big outbreaks in great black-backed gulls as well as common terns, of course, but we think there's more variation but even within a species about birds that are able to cope with infection and recover, and birds to which disease leads to death in extreme cases. So what is the future of high path? That's $1 million question that I think a lot of us are chewing on at the moment. So this is some data that my grad student put together. Along the x-axis, you can see month, and that's since the start of the outbreak on the very left-hand side of the axis. On the y-axis, these are the number of species where infections have been reported. This is from the USDA database. We have over 160 species of the roughly 1,000 bird species in the US that have been infected with high path to date. But there's sort of good news when you look at this chart actually for a little bit longer. So there was a very, very rapid range expansion when the virus first arrived, but you can see it's starting to plateau and slow down, which is kind of interesting. So these are each of these individual bars. These are actually monthly cumulative totals. So it's the month before plus the current month will equal each of these bars. So they will always go up. But you can see that we're at about 160 right now. But, you know, I think it's been at least a year and we've seen a bit of a leveling off in terms of the host range expansion. So we think that there might be some constraints here to the virus's ability to jump into new hosts. We will probably see additional new hosts, but the rate of expansion has definitely slowed down, which is really good news. But the host jumping is still incredibly unpredictable. Even though the host range is sort of stabilizing, the host jumping of this virus into species that we didn't know could host this virus is actually unprecedented. So here is a particular example. So you may have heard about these are our tertiary consumers, right? These are species that are way high up on the food chain. And it is an astonishing event to me to hear of seals, dolphins, ospreys, red-tailed hawks, even peregrine falcons, foxes and coyotes getting infected with bird flu. I mean, if you told me that 10 years ago when I was in Egypt, I would have just said impossible. But here we are, I'm on a stage trying to explain to you why this virus is like jumping into all of these like top predator species that really shouldn't be infected with the virus. So when you look more closely at food web interactions, turns out dabbling ducks are sort of like, you know, way down, like everything eats dabbling ducks, right? And then they also get hunted as well. So there's like quite high turnovers of those populations that we see. But foxes actually account for half of the mammalian infections amongst wild mammals in the US. We see black bears, grizzlies, opossums, skunks, you name it, have been infected with high path. But half of those mammalian cases are actually foxes. And we think the real reason is because they're depredating and they're feeding on dabbling ducks and other wild bird species as well. That's probably going to explain that. So you never really know where this will end in terms of the interesting additional species that will be added to the mix of this host range. At least in wild birds, we think it's slowing down. And the other interesting component to this, we have seen these really large-scale marine mammal outbreaks too. And so we understand that seals and dolphins tend to, it's trickier to explain the transmission pathway, but we think that these are species, these are marine mammals that tend to be share habitat with, right, a lot of our wild bird species that are also hosts for the virus. And that's how these sort of complicated transmission pathways happen, is we have water birds that are sharing habitat with seals and dolphins, and also we had a huge sea lion outbreak off the coast of Peru. and that's likely more due to waterborne transmission and not depredation working its way up the food web. That explains why these marine mammals are getting infected as well. All right, so here's my final call to action for everyone, and I like to remind myself of these things too, so it's good for me to see this slide. What can we all do about this? Stay calm and go birding is my best piece of advice. So birders and nature lovers really are the eyes and ears of this outbreak. There's so many people who are invested in the conservation and welfare of birds that take daily walks with their binoculars. They're the people that tell us about whether the baseline health of these birds, whether they're healthy. Great information, please tell us that. Additional information, you've seen a bird that's dead, take a photo and post it on iNaturalist, or use your apps to help us understand what species are being infected and why. Support our local wildlife rehabilitation centres. They are really the unsung heroes of this outbreak, in my opinion. They do amazing work to help birds recover, with which we would have absolutely no idea that this is going on. So there's a lot of under-resourced and overworked people who volunteer in wildlife rehabilitation centres, and so I think it's always worth sort of calling out and spotlighting the work that they do, and they have been amazing during this outbreak as well. Rethink eating habitats. All right, so this is a little uncomfortable, but I have to put it out there. Our reliance on industrialized food creates conditions for emerging diseases. That maybe would have been controversial 10 years ago. I don't think anyone disputes that anymore. So it's a little complicated to be out there caring about wild bird habitat when it sort of begs the question about what are the foods that we consume, and whether there's any processes there that need a big rethink. And I should say that a lot of this industrialized food, yes, we're definitely reliant on it. It creates efficiency in our system, but there's a lot of reasons, not just wild birds dying of bird flu, that are a reason to rethink those components. Those are not necessarily healthy for humans. They're not great for the planet. And now finally, they're not good for wildlife either. A lot of that industrialized big ag that we have, particularly in the US as well. And finally, encouraging the next generation of scientists. So our urban populations really benefit from exposure to nature. So whenever we go out to Appledore or Nantucket or the Boston Harbor Islands, it's really, for me, it's incumbent that I try and reach the next generation of students that we have at UMass Boston, and we like to take students who maybe have never been to the field but will get hands-on with seeing birds and experiencing nature close up. And I think that's the original moment where, like, watching all of those sandpipers probing the mud in the Copper River Delta, those are those really awe-inspiring moments that give you joy, that can happen. And so I can talk to us, but I think also about engaging the next generation of scientists to really care about wildlife and these infectious emerging diseases that are really undermining a lot of these populations as well. Great. And so with that, I would just like to thank a whole host of people that are involved in this work. This slide should be at least 10 slides to thank all the people, but I have a really talented team, current and past members at UMass Boston, different rehab centers that we've worked with. Tufts have also been amazing. That was like my home lab where I emerged from, where I undertook a lot of my training in disease ecology and virology as well. And a big shout out to Wendy Puryear there as well. Mass Audubon, I work all the time with folks at the US Geological Survey as well. And I'm usually picking the brains of people at the NIH when it comes to understanding viruses too, and our funding sources for a lot of this work. So thank you very much. Great.
Nicola, that is an incredible body of work that you've been involved with your partners and your lab. we definitely want to open it up to questions for people here, for folks that are online. So be thinking of your questions if you're on the Zoom. I'm going to ask what I think would probably be a question that other folks would have here, which is those of us that have bird feeder stations and bird baths. It seems like there's been some kind of concern raised about, are we aggravating the problem by having those set up? Is that something you could address?
Yeah, I definitely have opinions about it. So I think the data suggests it's not really a big transmission pathway. So it's very, very low risk. In fact, we addressed that in a study with the Linda Loring Foundation, Nature Foundation, that are on Nantucket. They had an osprey that died of highly pathogenic avian influenza. And they were very concerned. They had a lot of bird feeders and bird baths on their property, and we did longitudinal sampling of the water, and we never recovered any virus from the water baths, certainly. And so I think it's supporting birds is also important during the outbreak as well. And so if the bird feeders and bird baths are helping support these populations, I think that's actually important to do. So currently we don't think there's much evidence to support transmission that is happening in bird baths or bird feeders. And it might be a little bit to do with the types of species that actually do use those resources as well. So a lot of our passerines we get very limited outbreaks. We don't see big outbreaks or die-offs in a lot of these backyard bird species, like cardinals, like blue jays, like robins. And that's a population that I think a lot of people have eyes on, but we just don't see outbreaks happening. So we think it's more rooted in our aquatic or water bird species with these interesting sporadic outbreaks that might happen. A big host jump will happen, but it usually tends to not result in an ongoing or an onward transmission at that point. So I think your bird feeders and your bird baths are okay, in my opinion.
Well, that's good news in a scenario that has lots of not so good news.
Yeah, definitely.
Here you go.
Thank you, Nicola. That was great. I wonder if you could give us a couple of examples of easily achievable and affordable food choices. What can we do differently that won't be, off the wall or hard to do?
It's interesting. So, I mean, I'm a disease ecologist. I study viruses. I study wild birds, and sometimes it's hard to study this area and not get into food policy because it's hard to ignore that is upstream of the problem. And so I'm not a food policy expert, but I think it's just that question of like, what sits right with you about your own food choices? Buried deep in the back of your freezer, that bag of chicken nuggets that's probably come from who knows what source. Those are the types of food choices I think might be worth thinking about. But I wish I had more information. It's mostly I don't want to sort of, it's a little outside of my wheelhouse, Jim, but that's a great question. But it has made me vegetarian is what I will say. So I definitely try to model that. Yeah.
Yeah. So the answer might be come closer to vegetarianism, even if you're not ready to do it.
Yeah, the eating lower on the food chain thing. And I mean, this is one of the reasons, but there are so many other reasons, including climate change, why that's actually a really good idea as well. So it starts to be like, this just becomes momentum around why we should be, making some of these life changes that are easy to accomplish.
And this isn't fair, but for me to slip in another question, but I have the mic, so I'm going to run with it. Would you give us a rehab center that in Massachusetts that you think highly of? Put in a plug for someone.
Yes. We have two that we work with. And so New England Wildlife Center and Wild Care in Cape Cod. So there's two in Cape Cod, and that often happens because we work on Nantucket and of course parts of the Cape. And so when we have a bird that we need to rehab that looks like it's symptomatic for bird flu, those are the 2 locations that we go to. But there's so many more out there that I know that I just, this is the importance of doing talks like this, is to try and connect with rehab centers. I think the complication comes, they're good people, they want to do this work, they want to help understand the science and unpack why is this virus deadly in one species but not in another. But they're often incredibly hands full with the work that they do. It is just so hard to support them. So I'm, in the stage of my career where I would like to write grants and just support the work that they do, even if it's just like building extra facilities for them to like actually provide supportive care to birds that are symptomatic for bird flu would be such a great outcome for me at this point. And I think you could get so much great science from it as well. So those are the 2 that I'm aware of, but I'm sure that there are others.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering, you've identified sort of the industrial food, whatever you want to call it, complex as the source of where the virus is originating from.
Yep.
But are there suspicions about other sources at this point?
Tell me more.
So what I'm thinking is, like, you talked about how a virus only becomes problematic
Yep.
when something's haywire
Yeah.
in the environment,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so what I'm hearing you say is that at this moment,
Yeah.
what we're pointing to is the industrialized production
Yeah.
of poultry
Yep.
as the place where something in the environment has gone haywire.
Yeah, exactly.
But and now you see all the pathways that the
Yeah.
virus is spreading. But because it's spreading, beyond birds,
Yep.
could that be an indication that there are other locations where we would find something amiss? I mean, and if we're paying attention to the environment, it makes sense to me that there would be.
Yep.
But I'm just wondering if the science is giving us any information.
I think I need, you might have to give me some examples. Do you mean about like environmental persistence of the virus or other reservoirs outside of poultry for high path?
Yes.
Okay. Basically, no.
Okay.
And I'm pretty confident in saying that. So whenever we do phylogenetic trees as well, like, so we will take a lot of a lot of the viral sequence data that exists, and there's tons and tons of it now, actually. Usually at the root of that tree is poultry. And it's fairly consistent that evolution of the virus into those deadly forms, it just happens in poultry. We have never seen that happen in any other host. It's actually remarkable that it is limited to poultry. But when there's a lot of the mutations that are introduced that happen in poultry, you just don't see them anywhere else. So there's something about that system. And I should say it's not sort of about pointing fingers. It's more just like how interesting it is that signal is so clear and apparent. But there's no doubt that poultry
It is
are.
fascinating. I'm
And
fascinated.
yeah, exactly, like Galliformes. So that taxonomic group of birds, it tends to be where we see that, but it also has to be in an industrial setting as well. So there's a lot of folks who have backyard chickens as well, who like to know, what's the status, what should I do as well. I think those are important questions. Oftentimes we find with backyard poultry, they tend to be a little bit of a dead end, because they don't enter the market chain.
Right.
So it's quite a different, when you look at like food production and trade, backyard farms just don't really, they can be a bit of an interface between wild birds and poultry, but it doesn't usually go back and forth at that point. And those birds are usually like subsistence farms, like people would consume them on their own property. So it's just definitely, it seems to be like the bigger
Got it.
farms that we see this, and it's not just the US, it's like globally as well. Yeah, great question.
I have a tag-on question to that. Is it are they testing the waste products, like
Oh, yeah.
coming out of the, like, is it coming from the
Yes.
waste, or is it coming from the dead animals, or is it coming from like sparrows going in and interacting with the chickens? Like,
Good question.
where is it coming from? And I
Yeah.
know that like chicken waste is used in compost.
Ooh, yeah.
Like, what are the sources of it? How's it getting out of the poultry farms?
Yes. So all of those things that you just said? Yes. So, so it doesn't help that the virus will transmit via respiratory. So you walk into a barn where there's an infection of poultry and it will be airborne, but they can also shed it fecally. And so what happens to that waste, you know, as you were saying, it's used for composting. Sometimes it's used as for other sources. It's sort of repurposed, is how I would put it, as a nutrient. So we're definitely worried about that, because we can have high path move through the environment as well into wastewater. So avian influenza is an RNA virus. That's one piece that means that it's a little bit environmentally unstable. It's not like DNA viruses or other pathogens. RNA viruses tend to degrade, especially enveloped RNA viruses tend to degrade quite quickly. But that's a relative thing. It might be enough for a transmission chain to occur so that we have shedding into the feces, wastewater, wherever that goes downstream, that becomes a transmission chain for wild birds that way. But we also have, so there was recently an outbreak in cattle of bird flu. And at that site, they found dead blackbirds and starlings. So not species that I would necessarily think are major hosts. These are ones that can move around a little bit, but not a whole lot. So they were found dead on the property, or very nearby the property of the cattle farm in Texas, which was sort of like the origin of how H5N1, this bird flu strain, has now moved through I think it's about 13 states in the US in cattle industry, and has spilled over into humans that way. So like I say, if there's anything that's worth taking home, it's that slide where I was like, host range is tapered off, but the pathways are still really unpredictable. Like that host jumping thing, it's wide open. So all of those sources that you just named, yes.
And no federal regulations for these facilities to test their waste and test their animals?
To a degree, but I think there aren't resources. So I think when chickens start dying on the property, then the reaction can be quite quick, and you'll have to quarantine or shut down. You certainly can't sell your animals at that point. It usually involves you know, they'll basically kill all poultry on the property and within a certain perimeter to stop any possibility of transmission. But testing wastewater is becoming increasingly important because it can be, could be a source for which we see interspecies or host jumping, is via those environmentally or those contaminated waterways, for sure. But that's complicated, man. I mean, yeah, like we're still in a COVID pandemic, if you know what I mean. Like people are very stretched. And so I think it's this question of resources, but you've got to spend them wisely too and be targeted. But I think wastewater and the tools to do that are increasingly part of the conversation. So that's right, yeah.
So a question here. Since chickens are, domesticated and, they're not out in the wild, is there any effort to try to like immunize them or to breed a version that's immune somehow?
I love that idea. Yeah, so chickens, when you trace back that evolutionary history, they go way back into jungle fowl, right? Like in some of those parts of Asia. And so when I've done work in Bangladesh, you'll work alongside local scientists there, and they'll speak about poultry breeds that are actually, they consider tolerant to infectious disease. And so they're more indigenous breeds of poultry. that seem to be a little bit more tolerant to infection and won't die. And so those are the interesting conversations that you have when you're like handling a bird and you're like chatting with someone side by side, and they'll be like, yeah, there's like, I can't remember the names. There's about 3 different names of indigenous poultry that I've learned about in Bangladesh where you're right, they tend to not die of infection. So there's something, definitely something in that in terms of thinking about indigenous breeds. But when you start to industrialize them, I think that's when the gene pool may be altered, and you might see them become more susceptible again. So it's this question of scale, I think, a little bit. But that's a great question worth thinking about. And your vaccination question, we are not vaccinating chickens yet in the US, but that's certainly has been happening for many years in China, with relative success, actually. And in Europe as well, there's a lot of conversation about trying to do that. It complicates the trade of chickens, so they should be pathogen-free to qualify for being traded. And if they have antibodies against flu, you don't know whether that's a vaccination or a natural infection, and so you can't guarantee that your flock hasn't come into contact with the virus. So it complicates the trade implications, vaccination here. And so it's a big discussion at the USDA about how to proceed, but I think it's about time that we start to think about that more seriously. Yeah.
Oh, well, I know we should be wrapping up in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to bring in a question that came in from one of our virtual attendees, Nancy Morgan. Have the cases of influenza increased in the past hundreds of years? And is there a connection to pollution and the climate crisis?
Ooh, I'm glad someone brought up the climate crisis. So it turns out there have been cases of bird flu since humans started farming birds. We don't know what the strain is, but it's thought to be some kind of bird flu that was circulating. And of course, we think that probably originated somehow from wild birds, but when you put domesticated birds together, throughout the course of human history, there's some evidence that bird flu has been around for a while, actually, but not on the scale of the outbreaks that we're seeing today. This is like a new chapter is how I would describe the last 10 years. And then in the US, a new chapter in the last like 2 years. Climate change, we think, is going to have an interesting complicating effect on the virus. We were talking about how it's an RNA virus. It doesn't tend to last very long outside the host, but it can for, a period of time, days to maybe 7 days, in extreme cases longer if it's cold and fresh water and neutral pH. So there are conditions that favor the virus actually lasting, but all of those conditions are the opposite of what climate change will do. So in a warming climate, the virus is predicted to not last very long. So we think we'll see more breaks in those transmission chains. But here's the other complicating factor, is that it will change wild bird behavior. So we've probably all heard of the advancing spring migration, where birds are reaching those northern latitude breeding grounds much earlier than they should be. And as I was showing, that high latitudes tend to be a bit of a jumping off point for the virus in terms of we get big mass migrations during the breeding season, huge densities of birds. And so if we have wild bird populations aggregating at higher latitudes for a longer period of time, we do think that we might see more outbreaks. So there's opposing effects, right? We don't think the virus will last as long, but we think the host behavior will change to favor transmission. So I have a couple of colleagues who are doing some interesting modeling work in that space to try and simulate what might happen under those conditions. And it's a little complicated. It's a little bit different to, say, Zika or a West Nile virus or an arbovirus that thrives in mosquitoes. I think the Achilles heel of this virus is the fact that it's an RNA virus that can degrade in the environment. So we'll see what happens, but yeah.
Well, I'm sure there are many more questions in our group here, and those who joined us virtually. Please feel free to stay on a bit. Nicola, can you answer some questions
Definitely.
informally? Okay,
course.
that would be lovely.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for making something that's very complicated feel like I can understand this a little better now, and I
That's the
hope
goal.
the rest of you had that experience as well. Really appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.